Welcome to Impact Exchange at Monash Business School. I'm Nick McGuigan, Associate Professor of Accounting, and I'm here today with Professor Mervyn King. Mervyn, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Mervyn, Nelson Mandela's been quite an influential individual in your life, and in fact he actually ended up, encouraging you to take on a corporate governance role.
Well, as an article clerk in the legal profession, I met Mr. Mandela. He was then practicing in a street called Fox Street in Johannesburg, and that's where I first met Mr. Mandela. Then there was the treason trial. He went to jail, and while he was in jail, I was then qualified as a barrister and practicing as a junior barrister. And for certain reasons, I came to become chairman of an organization called Operation Hunger with his two daughters. And that organization fed 2.5 million children every day for 17 years. So we fed these children while Mr. Mandela was in jail. When he came out of jail, he had a lunch for 12 people. I was privileged to be one of the 12, and he went round the table. But this time I had become a judge, and I had resigned over matters of conscience. It's not relevant here. And he said, well, if it wasn't for Mervyn, there'd be millions of citizens, useless citizens, because if one doesn't feed a child under the age of 3, their brains atrophy. Mm-hmm. So Mr. Mandela then became president of South Africa, and I lived actually a few houses away from his house, just by coincidence, and he and I sometimes had breakfast together. He liked oats, and I eat oats for breakfast. We used to share that. So from time to time he telephoned me and discussed things with me. So I had experience of both sides of the corporate coin, and I think it was for those reasons that I was approached by the Institute of Directors, Society of Accountants of South Africa, the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Would I form a committee and write guidelines for the majority of my fellow citizens who had not been in the mainstream of the economy and now were suddenly going to come with equal opportunity, and yet had no guidance as to how to direct or how to manage? Would I write those guidelines? And it was, I said, let me think about that, because I was quite busy. It was one of those days I got a call from Mr. Mandela, and whenever he wanted a favour, it would start like this: how's my favourite judge?
Oh, really?
Then I knew I had to do a lot of work without remuneration. Mm-hmm. But so we had our discussion about schooling, and then I told him about this approach to me, and he said, do it, you're the right man. And yes, so he did encourage me.
Through the King's reports, you're constantly pioneering new forms of corporate governance and have been doing that for decades. Can you tell us a little bit about why you chose a life of positive activism? Yes,
I chose it because my experience as a QC in the commercial legal sphere, and then the practical knowledge of being chairman of companies listed in London and Europe and Southern Africa, and a director and chief executive of 2 companies, I started seeing governance through a very informed set of eyes. And I didn't like what I saw, because the theory was financial capitalism was the order of the day. Right. And you build up value at the top, and it's supposed to trickle down to the unequal at the bottom. Well, it never did. Mm-hmm. As I have said often, the trickle became treacle and stuck on the top. Mm-hmm. And we know that inequality gap has just sort of broadened. Mm-hmm. And I think it's one of the issues on planet Earth that has to be addressed. Otherwise we're going to have problems right through the globe. So my actual driver was that I believed that shareholder-centric model had led to unsustainable development. Mm-hmm. So my first report was in 94, and by 95, with the third industrial revolution of the 60s and 70s, the computer age, research was expedited, and that research showed that we had reached ecological overshoot, that in fact you and I as individuals, but more especially companies, both public and private, had used and were using natural assets faster than nature was regenerating them, clearly not a sustainable matter. And so these were the drivers of me coming out with models different from models which had persistence from the middle of the 19th century, exacerbated by the famous corporate case of the Ford Motor Company, and then worsened by the theories of the late Milton Friedman, that the sole purpose of the corporation, as he called it, is to make profit without deception. And I always say, with respect to the deceased, at any cost, and it was at a huge cost. And his free part of the free economy was actually not free at all. It was subsidized by society and the environment. And so society, what is absolutely fascinating to me, became fascinating to me, was that the company is this incapacitated, inanimate person, and yet society became outraged against companies, seeing the companies as degrading the environment. The companies actually were innocent throughout the 20th century. It was its corporate leaders that were actually steering companies to how they made their money and how they produced a product which had these adverse impacts on the environment. But of course society saw it as the company. And then I also criticize regulators, because what regulators did in the late 20th century into the 21st century, they've regulated these outcomes as a result of the conduct of the corporate leaders, instead of addressing this issue at source, which really is that collective mind of the board, which was making decisions in the best interest of the shareholders, which skewed everything and resulted in a planet which we know now has been degraded and is resource constrained.
It's really interesting, Mervyn, because you've talked about the conscious company in the past. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by the conscious company?
So the question is, has the company's leaders got a conscience? Are they conscious leaders? Because you're only going to have a conscious company if those corporate leaders are conscious.
Here in Australia, we've just had a royal commission into the banking industry and financial industries, and I'm kind of curious to learn a little bit about how conscious companies might play out within that particular context.
Well, I think it's a great example that there was a lack of conscious leadership. That one has to ask the question, were the corporate leaders of those banks conscious leaders in the sense of actually applying their minds as to what is in the best long-term interest of the health of this bank? Is it in the long-term best interest of the health of this company to charge deceased people money? Is it the long-term best interest of the health of this company to do what they did? The answer clearly was in the negative. And yet they went on. Why? They were driven to add to that bottom line at a cost, and it was a reputational cost. Now, reputation has become one of the great asset values in the intangible asset world of the 21st century. And with respect to those corporate leaders, they were not conscious corporate leaders. As a result, the company is not a conscious company.
Now, Mervyn, we've just had National Australia Bank come out and say it will take a good 10 years to move on from the Royal Commission and what was uncovered. I'm kind of curious to learn a little bit about how we might be designing for good corporate governance.
Yes. Well, I always say reputation comes in step by step, but it leaves on horseback. And that's what's happened to National Bank. So they're probably right, 10 years to rebuild that trust and confidence. One of the critical issues, I believe governance moved into the 21st century to a mindless checklist approach to governance. So if you take the classic case of Enron, for example, you and I could have done an audit on their governance. They had a preponderance of non-executive directors. They had a chartered accountant as the chair of the audit committee. They had a nominations committee. They had a corporate governance committee. You could have ticked every box. But Mr. Skilling and Mr. Lay were intellectually dishonest. they were exercising their share options every quarter, quarterly reporting in America. And the biggest buyer of their shares was the Enron pension fund, of which they were the trustees. And when Enron collapsed, the shares became valueless. 77,000 people were impacted upon adversely. And Mr. Skilling, when it came to sentencing, he said to the judge that, you know, I'm a very religious man. I go to church every Sunday. I wondered at the time, if I was the prosecutor, if I'd asked him, Mr. Skilling, would you made these decisions as the curator of an incapacitated human being? Why did you do that to an incapacitated, inanimate person that's an integral part of society? When a human being dies, 100 people mourn, 1,000 people mourn and are impacted upon. When Enron died, it affected 77,000 people at least. When Lehman Brothers died, 2 billion people were affected. That's the impact today of the corporation society, how integral it's become to society.
Mervyn, that conscious company, that unconscious incapacitated company, how do we breathe governance consciousness into that company?
Well, my view is that it's got to become mindful governance. And that's why the 4th iteration of the King Report, I've turned the thing on its head.
Okay.
Excuse me. What I said to my committee is, we have a situation in the world that's developed in the 21st century. We have an outcomes-based framework in the IRC. We have outcomes-based SDGs, clean water, clean production. These are all outcomes. Shouldn't companies therefore operate in an outcomes-based governance paradigm? What are the outcomes of good governance? And it was a huge debate with my committee and me. And we came to the conclusion there were 4 outcomes. And these are they: that ethical culture with effective leadership, adequate and effective controls with informed oversight by the board, value creation in a sustainable manner, trust and confidence in the community, by the community in which the company operates, with legitimacy of operations. Those 4 outcomes. If a company achieves those 4 outcomes, they've been practicing good governance. The question is, what are those basic principles to achieve those outcomes? We came to the conclusion there were 16 basic principles. That's all. And the rest are actually practices we've developed since 1989, 1990, the Cadbury Report. These are practices we've developed, like the Audit Committee, the Nominations Committee. They're not principles, they're actually practices.
Mervyn, I'm really curious to learn a little bit about what you see as the biggest challenges to achieve integrated thinking within organisations and also within the mind of the accountants.
Well, I think the biggest challenge is to move away from the silo thinking in which we were educated, and to break down those silos. And I'm absolutely delighted that we, the IRC, started a whole program with our major accountancy bodies being members of the council to agree that you have to start educating the educators to teach differently. And there are many universities, I think including yours, that's actually teaching far differently than you taught 5 years ago. Your accountancy students. And they're getting an understanding. What has happened is people on the job, as it were, starting to learn about integrating their thinking. But younger chartered accountants are coming out today imbued with the concept of integrated thinking. So they're a step ahead. And that's why I'm starting to encourage boards to try and get millennials on the boards, actually, because you get that new thinking on the board and you mix it up.
So it's something about trying to bring those different disciplines together. So
Absolutely.
Maybe accountants working with artists, accountants working with scientists,
Absolutely
engineers.
Right.
Fantastic. Mervyn, we are coming to a close, and thank you very much for joining us for our sessions. I'm just kind of curious to learn a little bit about how you think we can best create conditions for a thriving planet, thriving humanity, and thriving business, and if we can do that in an integrated way.
Well, I think technology is going to be the answer. I know everybody's terrified of technology and increased unemployment, but I cannot, the state of mind I'm in at the moment and the level of knowledge that we've got at the moment, see our being able to feed and house and board and lodge 11.8 billion people on this planet with the kind of agricultural, kind of manufacturing mode we have today. It's got to be advanced.
Absolutely.
So the foreman of factories will be a robot, and agriculture, food will be grown on this wall, on the walls of cities. They just won't be on the ground. I mean, the thing will change completely.
Yep.
And we have to change. And the critical thing to me is to always remember two things. That the company has got no conscience, and the conscience is leaders. And the leaders have to be absolutely aware that the company is dependent on various sources of value creation. They've got to identify those. And we've given them the framework with the 6 capital model in the IRC. And they've got to be aware that in using those sources of value creation in the activities of how the company makes its money, that it does have an impact on. So dependent on, impact on. They're two different understandings. And you have an impact on the economy, society, and the environment, and then you have the outcomes of those impacts.
Right.
So I think to understand this outcomes-based approach to governance is absolutely critical for the sustainability of the planet.
And that notion of integrated thinking is really having that conscious mind inside the corporate governance.
Absolutely.
Mervyn, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Very kind.